This woman had several nicknames: the Godmother, the Black Widow, and the Queen of Cocaine. She lived a long, brutal, and truly horrific life, during which violence and impunity were always at her side. She stopped at nothing and even sacrificed the lives of her beloved sons for her own unhealthy ambitions. Her criminal genius created dozens of routes that drug dealers still use today, and her invented methods of destroying enemies are still legendary. During her life, she managed to unleash a bloody war, to flood America first with cocaine, then crack, to plan the kidnapping of Kennedy's son, and to introduce Pablo Escobar to the drug business. So, if you're interested in hearing about the most successful woman in the drug industry, then meet Griselda Blanco on the other side of the law. Griselda Blanco was born in the slums surrounding the Colombian city of Cartagena on February 15, 1943. Her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, was a maid at a wealthy estate in Cartagena, but was fired when she became pregnant by her patron. 3 years later, Ana Lucia had to leave Cartagena for the communes of Medellin because of the universal censure of single motherhood. In 1948, Colombia was plunged for 10 years into a bloody chaos that went down in history as the La Violencia War. In the country reigned real lawlessness, associated with a confrontation of two political factions. Over the next 10 years, the Civil War officially claimed more than 200,000 lives, and millions of villagers were left without a roof over their heads. It was in such an atmosphere that little Griselda grew up. Going out for a walk every morning, the children came across fresh corpses and checked them for valuables, then dug graves for them. Human life was worth nothing. Griselda was 6 years older than Pablo Escobar, but Pablo was born in other, slightly more peaceful times. Because of poverty and devastation, by the age of 11, Griselda had become a professional pickpocket. But petty theft was dangerous and unprofitable, so she and a group of her friends came up with the idea of kidnapping a rich 10-year-old boy from the Medellin Valley. They tied him up and took him to a slum in the hills, expecting a ransom soon. But when the juvenile bandits realized they couldn't get the money and the boy's parents went to the police, Griselda was asked to kill him. Despite the fact that they were almost the same age, she shot him in the head. That unfortunate boy became the first in a long line of her victims. According to former DEA agent Bob Palombo, who stalked Blanco for decades, the future Black Widow was destined for a life of criminal antisocial behavior. I don't think the fact that she was a woman trying to prove something to men had anything to do with her violent behavior. I just think it was inherent in Griselda Blanco from childhood. It goes back to the beginning of her life and how and where she was raised. She was just a violent person. At 14, she ran away from an abusive mother and stepfather who molested her. And to survive, she picked the pockets of gawkers on the streets and prostituted herself in the slums of Medellin. While hanging out around the airport, Griselda met young marginalized kids like herself and started dealing pot. At the same time, she began to make acquaintances from this environment. This is where she will meet her future companion, Alberto Bravo. She also met the love of her life, Jose Dario Trujillo, a handsome street hustler with the telling nickname Pestañas, which meant eyelashes. Trujillo had his own way of doing things. Officially, he moonlighted as a car washer. Unofficially, he forged immigration papers, helped compatriots go after the American dream for a small fee, and had his own local pot distribution network in New York City. Blanco fell head over heels in love with Trujillo, and they married. Griselda gave birth to Trujillo's 3 sons, Uber, Dixon, and Osvaldo, one after the other, but her fortunes as a happy housewife passed her by. When she was in her early 20s, the whole family moved to New York City and started doing business from there, gradually becoming central players in the distribution of drugs in the United States. It started with Griselda's street girlfriends, carrying pot and panties and bras with special pockets, and platform shoes and high heels that Griselda herself had invented. She even opened up a small lingerie shop in Medellin, where the mules could stock up on the fittings they needed for successful transportation. The mules were getting bigger and bigger, but pot wasn't the most profitable drug for transportation. So at first, of course, there was money, but not as much as when cocaine came into play. Blanco and Trujillo were soon joined by another Antioquian, Alberto El Capitan Bravo. He was nicknamed El Capitan because of his military service in the Navy, and this fact served him well. Bravo had many acquaintances there, and he also knew safe routes for transportation that would allow him to scale up. This was in the late 60s, and around the same time, Blanco started shipping cocaine paste, bazuco, from Bolivia and Peru. But the problem was that this paste needed to be processed into crystalline cocaine for the American market. Because bazuco was caustic, meant for smoking only, and inconvenient to transport. This is how the first processing laboratories in Medellin came into being, owned by Griselda. Consequently, supplies were small and the cost of crystalline cocaine to the end user was very high. Still, it was being supplied. In 1970, Griselda's favorite husband and associate, the father of her children, José Pestañas Trujillo, died of cirrhosis of the liver caused by hepatitis in a Queens hospital. Despite all the gossip that it was Blanco who took him out, it appears that he was indeed the love of her life and the man about whom she never said a bad word and continued to carry his last name for the rest of her life. Contrary to popular belief, she was not involved in his death. Indeed, she lived with his mother, her mother-in-law, until her arrest. But the nickname Black Widow would still stick to her in the future. After Pestaña's death, the business remained with Blanco, and she became close to Alberto Bravo, to whom she married. According to Griselda's youngest son, Michael, there was no romantic relationship between them, only purely business, and the marriage was concluded for convenience. They both had to travel a lot between New York, Miami, and Medellin on business, which grew by leaps and bounds. The tandem of Blanco and Bravo quickly became the centerpiece of drug distribution within the United States. They used all possible ways, an army of mules, the types of which were constantly changing. They were women, or old people, or couples, and secret compartments in the bottoms of boats, and entire trunks of legendary Samsonite suitcases. And they also mastered the air routes. If anyone in Colombia was thinking of entering the US market, it was mostly this couple they turned to. By the mid-1970s, Griselda's people were supplying a hefty amount for those days, 50 and 100-kilogram batches of cocaine, produced in Medellin on local raw materials, where the Medellin cartel was already beginning to form. By 1975, Griselda was already earning several $1 million a month and led a luxurious lifestyle, not denying herself anything. She held grand parties, which poured a river of expensive champagne, and the tables were scattered with the world's best Colombian cocaine. On the subject of Blanco's relationship with Escobar, she was essentially the one who paved the way for him. They were from the same disadvantaged neighborhood, and at a time when Griselda was making hundreds of thousands, Pablo was still making timid attempts to enter the business. There are different versions of their acquaintance, but one way or another, without the paths traveled by Griselda, the Medellins would not have been successful in becoming the largest cocaine cartel in the world by 1982. They had a complicated relationship, but up to a certain point they ran in parallel. Pablo is credited with saying, "Of all men, I feared only a woman, and her name was Griselda Blanco." Because of a client list that included movie stars and famous athletes, Blanco's growing New York organization attracted the attention of law enforcement. A joint NYPD and DEA investigation, dubbed Operation Banshee because of the large number of women involved in the development, led to federal charges against Blanco and 37 of her subordinates for running a transportation organization in April 1975. At the time, it was the largest cocaine case in history, and also the first time a shipment of an unprecedented 100 kilograms was taken off a ship. And further, there are two versions of how Griselda got back to her homeland. The first is that immediately after the jury's guilty verdict, she disappeared. "We had her in custody on drug charges," recalls Agent Palombo, who was a central player in Operation Banshee. But she couldn't be found anywhere. Without the feds' knowledge, Blanco slipped out of the country to Colombia, where she killed Bravo in a dramatic shootout. The second version, voiced by her son now, is that Griselda posted a cash bail of $1 million and also left New York without waiting for the trial. Somehow, she ended up back in Medellin, where, in her son's words, she, quote, got in trouble, unquote. With the increased productive capacity of the Colombians, the supply chain needed to be expanded. From Medellin, Griselda had no way of managing the business, and there was a flood of traders of all stripes, especially Cubans, pouring through the front gates of Miami. Her authority over the market was in danger of eroding, plus no one took her seriously. Trading had always been a man's business, so Griselda started making everyone play by her own rules. She took control of the only airport in the city, bribed officials and police, and became famous for her repulsive character. It was rumored that at one of her ghastly parties, Griselda ordered 4 people shot on suspicion of treason. If someone did not pay her on time, they received a bullet without any talk. It was during this bloody period that Blanco pioneered the motorcycle execution, the invention of which is credited to her. 1 or 2 motorcyclists would ride past the victim, showering him with bullets, a practice that later became widely used by drug traffickers throughout Latin America. Blanco herself always carried a gun, and had a reputation for not hesitating to use it. Gradually, a circle of confidants began to form around her. She hypnotized people, Agent Palumbo recounted. She knew how to make them her loyal followers, but she was also feared. Everyone who worked for her knew that she wouldn't ask anyone to do anything she wouldn't do herself. It was then, during the Medellin period, that she was nicknamed La Madrina, the godmother. In the beginning, it was the literal sense. She was actually godmother to over 200 Medellin babies. But then the prank got out of hand. That same year, 1975, Alberto Bravo was murdered. And here, too, there are several mutually exclusive versions. The first, the most famous, is that Griselda killed him herself in the parking lot of a nightclub in Bogota because of the millions of dollars missing from the profits of the cartel they created together. In the heat of the argument, Blanco, 32, pulled out a gun. Bravo responded by pulling out an Uzi submachine gun, and after a fierce gunfight, he and 6 bodyguards lay dead. Blanco, who suffered only a minor gunshot wound to the abdomen, recovered and moved to Miami shortly thereafter. The second and third versions rule out Griselda's involvement. According to the second, Bravo was killed by none other than Pablo Escobar, whose life Griselda's men made an unsuccessful attempt on. But the third is the most interesting. It involves Papo Mejia, who came out of Griselda's gang and wanted to get his hands on a bigger piece of the pie. As Griselda's son said, the cocaine wars started back in Colombia. First, Mejia stole 1,200 kilos from Blanco. Then, with Bravo dead, Papo thought Griselda's entire transportation network would fall apart and he'd just have to clean up his act. But that wasn't the case. Blanco assembled a new group of personally loyal enforcers, consisting of Jorge Rivi Ayala and the 3 Sepulveda brothers, Dario, Paco, and Diego, and set off for Miami, not least because the Colombian federales were after her for the alleged murder of El Capitan. Miami in the 70s was the front gate to the American dream for all of Latin America and a magnet for the underworld. Almost immediately after arriving, Griselda established a supply of several hundred kilos, but she wasn't satisfied. She wanted to own the city, and so she began a series of actions against local dealers aimed at physically eliminating all competitors. Blanco was unique in her absolute ruthlessness. If you bought drugs from her and didn't pay her back on time, Blanco killed you. If she bought drugs from you and didn't want to pay, she would kill you. By ordering the killing, Blanco ordered her gunmen to eliminate everyone in the neighborhood, including women and children. But the violence paid off. Soon the godmother was running a distribution network stretching from coast to coast. It employed 1,500 employees and brought in $80 million a month. In August 1978, she gave birth to a son by Dario Sepulveda and named him Michael Corleone because she adored the movie The Godfather and considered herself a female version of the main character. She named her favorite German shepherd Adolf Hitler, which probably refers to the messianism of Carlos Leder, another famous Colombian drug dealer who was half German and preached the ideas of the Third Reich, which could not pass Griselda. She bought a 25-carat pink diamond that belonged to Argentina's First Lady Eva Perón. Her closet included 300 pairs of designer shoes made of every conceivable kind of leather, and she drank tea from dishes that once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. She traveled around the city in a motorcade of limousines or Ferraris with a group of enforcers who were always with her. She never learned to drive herself, nor, for that matter, to read with confidence. Her methods of flooding Miami with white powder were so audacious that on the bicentennial of U.S. independence in 1976, she placed a ton of cocaine worth more than $40 million under the inner lining of the ship Gloria, which was participating in the celebration. The Miami gangsters were thrilled to be a part of her parties. A lavish penthouse on Biscayne Bay, a palace in Miami Beach, cocaine-fueled orgies with strippers catering to all needs, including those of the insatiable godmother who made no secret of her bisexuality. At the entrance to the mansion stood her bronze sculpture, which she had commissioned herself to have other drug lords rub it for good luck before shipping the goods. It was decadence on an epic level. But Blanco's bloodlust ruined the party. She broke a major commandment. She started consuming her goods. Not only was she snorting cocaine, but she was smoking bazooka, which causes extreme paranoia. One day, she heard someone call her fat, and legend has it that the offender was quartered and packed in a suitcase discarded on the beach. In the years she lived in Miami, she did a ton of cocaine herself, says Ryder Smith. She was a grandiose person, and her acts of violence, however egregious, made her feel sort of omnipotent. Thus came that list of victims in which Griselda put a price on the head of each, more or less, major dealer. Blanco actually wrote down on a piece of paper the names of all the characters on the drug market that she didn't want, and the price for each one's head. Some she suspected of collaborating with the feds, others were in her way or just didn't like. The hunt was on. At about 2:30 p.m. on July 11th, 1979, unsuspecting Colombian drug dealer Germán Jiménez Paneso and an accomplice were perusing the liquor shelves at Dadeland Mall looking for an expensive scotch. Before they could select a bottle, Blanco's 3 hitmen in a Ford Ecoline van opened frantic machine gun fire, killing both men and wounding 2 mall employees. It was a truly frenzied attack, a replay of 1920s Chicago, Dade County Chief Medical Examiner Ronald Wright said at the time. When cops arrived on the scene, they found the killers had left the van behind a shopping center. We called it a military van because its sides were padded with 1/4-inch steel with gun ports cut into them, recalled former Dade County homicide detective Raul Diaz. The gun ports were covered with one-sided plastic. The gunmen could look out and you couldn't look in. Inside that military van, police found about 20 shotguns, revolvers, and assault rifles. But that was just the beginning. Acting on orders from Griselda Blanco, Ayala and his gang murdered Alfredo and Grisel Lorenzo, a married couple who dealt drugs, in their South Miami home on May 26, 1982. They had failed to pay on time for a shipment they had received. Ayala said Blanco initially ordered the killing of everyone in the house, but he made sure Alfredo and Grisel Lorenzo's children were not harmed. There were 3 children, including a 1-year-old infant. Blanco had not forgotten about her old friend, Papo Mejia. In August of that same year, 1982, Ayala finally located Mejia in Colombia. Griselda's trusted hitman and her son Osvaldo followed him to a bar where Ayala threw a grenade at Papo, but he managed to escape. An angry Griselda then offered hitman Miguel Perez $100,000 to stab Papo with a 12-inch bayonet at the Miami airport, but the incredibly lucky barkeep somehow survived the attack again. After the failed assassination attempt, Perez attacked Mejia several times until Mejia was finally arrested and tried before a jury on February 3, 1983, in Tucson, where he was sentenced to 30 years in prison on March 18th. He was later released from prison in 2000, after which he disappeared and was never heard from again. All of this brought her too much attention. Blanco, however, was not bothered by the increased attention. According to Rivi Ayala, she loved to fight. Every day she would say, "We've got to get so-and-so. We've got to get so-and-so." That was what she liked. But Blanco's violence and lifestyle were taking their toll. Her addiction to cocaine and bazookas made her paranoid, and she would stay inside her house for 24 hours at a time, sitting inside the company of her dog, Adolf Hitler. Her sons had seen how the business was run from a young age, and it was no surprise that they all followed in their mother's footsteps. Griselda never cared much for their education, but all the boys from Trujillo were involved in motocross and martial arts from childhood. As they entered a more or less conscious age, they all became involved in their mother's business in one way or another. The most capable was the youngest, Osvaldo, or Chiqui, as he was known in the family. By the age of 17, in 1980, 3 of the 5 limousine rental offices in Miami belonged to him, and 2 years later, in 1982, he became the youngest drug lord, the 3rd in turnover of transported goods from the territory of Colombia. In addition, it was Chiqui, on behalf of the Blanco family, who cooperated with Carlos Leder, organizing the transport of goods through his island of Norman Cay. A little later, he would grow tired of Miami and begin to spread his influence to California and reach Orange County. For a long time, Griselda managed to remain undetected. She had about 20 aliases, a suitcase of false documents, and a scattering of wigs. She quietly went with her children to shopping malls and movie theaters, visited beauty salons, and moved freely in America and Colombia. But because of the wave of violence she raised, several things happened. First, the authorities finally woke up and began to take action. In 1980, the Central Tactical Unit, the so-called CENTAC, headed by the already mentioned Raul Diaz, was organized to develop cocaine cowboys. Secondly, Griselda's addiction to her product untied her tongue. She began to divulge details about her affairs to the wrong people, and the information consequently reached her informants. And thirdly, Jaime Bravo, Alberto Bravo's nephew, had followed her out of Medellin, fully convinced that it was Griselda who had killed his uncle. Jaime and the 2 armed men he brought from Colombia went to the malls where Griselda spent time shopping and just waited for her, Agent Palombo recalled. It got to the point where we had to interrupt our drug case against Griselda to get Jaime off the streets. So Griselda lost her freedom of movement, but not her ardor. The next victim was Chucho Castro. There were reasons for this, and several. According to one version, Chucho was a friend of Ayala, and when they were taken at the airport, Griselda only got Ayala out, and Chucho was on his own, and his wife impulsively promised to turn them all over to the FBI, which, of course, did not pass Griselda's ears. According to another version, Castro once slapped his mother's favorite Michael Corleone, which he immediately complained about. Either way, Chucho's car was shot when his 2-year-old son Johnny was sleeping in the back seat. The child died on the spot from 2 hits on the head from an automatic rifle line. Griselda commented, "They were lucky to be together." But so unlucky was her third husband, loyal pistolero Dario Sepulveda, who wanted to raise Michael Corleone as a normal child. Godmother did not want the boy to go to kindergarten and generally attended any institutions. She prophesied him a decent future in the family business, like the rest of the sons, and therefore young Corleone never left their mansion, attending all the parties and learning to shoot a real gun. Griselda had peculiar ideas about upbringing, which Sepulveda did not share, and so he took his son and fled to Colombia. To say that Griselda was furious is to say nothing. She launched a real operation to return Michael to the bosom of the family, spending several $1 million to bribe the police and immigration authorities. Eventually, the police detained Dario in Medellin, and he, fearing a repeat of Castro's history, fled lest his son fall victim to approaching gunfire. He was eventually shot in the back. Little Michael ran up to his father's mutilated body and hugged him, but it was too late. Dario was dead, an eyewitness recounted. Sepulveda is the only one of Griselda's husbands whose murder order she definitely gave, but the nickname Black Widow has stuck with her. Another murder which finally shattered her reputation in the eyes of the Medellin drug community, also unproven, but attributed to her, is the murder of Marta Ochoa. This was a family Griselda was familiar with from her barefoot childhood in Antioquia County. Though the Ochoas were not poor people like Griselda and Escobar, but Marta was a perpetual go-between for Griselda and her family. In 1981, poor Marta was kidnapped by the guerrilla group M19. In response, the brothers formed MAS, Muerte a Secuestradores, Death to the Kidnappers, an organization aimed at eliminating the top of this leftist radical movement, and as a result, Marta was released alive and unharmed a few months after her kidnapping. How and when Griselda managed to kill Marta with such relatives is not known, but it is certain that for the Medellin cartel, it was Blanco who was responsible for her death. So, by 1984, Blanco was surrounded on all sides. Jaime was looking for her, Agent Palombo had been after her since 1975, Sentac was on her trail, and the Medellinians had every right to eliminate her for lawlessness. As the enterprising Chiqui extended his influence all the way to California, that's where she went. By early 1985, Blanco, then 42, was holed up in a modest suburban bungalow in Irvine, California, with her mother Ana and youngest son Michael Corleone. Palombo and a DEA team followed her westward, setting up surveillance of the house. Blanco was essentially cornered. On the cloudy morning of February 20th, as Blanco lounged in bed, Palombo's team kicked in the door and rushed upstairs to the godmother's bedroom. It was a humiliating defeat. Palombo kissed Blanco on the cheek after she was handcuffed, fulfilling a long-standing promise to his fellow agents that one day he would catch her and seal it with a kiss. A federal magistrate judge quickly ordered Blanco held without bail, and news reports of her arrest heralded the demise of the cocaine queen. The federal indictment was based on the testimony of Blanco's former business friend, Carmen Caban, with whom they worked with in New York. Caban's testimony was enough to put Griselda away for 10 years. It all happened with the quote-unquote permission of the Medellins, who a little later also used pilot and smuggler George Young to testify against Leyder, who had become insane with his drug use and essentially dangerous to the business. However, Griselda Blanco's cocaine career was far from over. In late February 1985, small African-American drug dealer Charles Cosby sat in the living room of his modest home in the Brookfield Village neighborhood of East Oakland and watched a local television host announce Blanco's arrest. Cosby, then still peddling grams of diluted cocaine on East Oakland corners, was shocked when the anchor described the cocaine queen who had transported hundreds of kilograms into the United States. "I was amazed," Cosby recalls now. "I had never known of a woman who sold drugs, much less at that level. She was a billionaire. She was the nexus of the whole business." To a drug business profane like Cosby, Blanco became a true ideal. There are several versions of how he met her. The first, a friend of Cosby, admitted that he once worked as a courier for Blanco, and he asked to contact her, and to his surprise, she agreed. The second, he simply wrote her a letter, and Griselda wrote back. And then they called, and so began the strangest crime romance story ever. As luck would have it, Blanco was transferred to a maximum security federal prison for women offenders called Dublin, 20 miles from Oakland. After a series of phone calls and emails, Cosby met face-to-face with Blanco for the first time during visiting hours at the prison. When they met, a dressed-up Blanco wearing red shoes passionately embraced Cosby and kissed him on the lips. They then sat down at the visitor's table and got down to business. "How much merchandise do you need?" Blanco asked. "So can you sell in peace?" Cosby was stunned by the question and nervously named the weight he expected to be denied. 110 pounds. Blanco nodded, and that was the end of the meeting. 3 days later, the doorbell at Cosby's house rang. When he answered, a Latina woman with 2 packages bluntly said, "I have a package from the godmother." Cosby ripped open the boxes with trembling hands and discovered 110 pounds of cocaine. A month later, Cosby became a millionaire who paid his respects to Blanco in an unusual way. Every time he visited her in prison, Blanco paid guards $1,500 to have sex in the back of the prison's multi-purpose room. "When she brought me into the business, the whole system ran like clockwork. All I had to do was fly around the country and meet with the distributors," Cosby recounted. "Every time I shook someone's hand, I made $1 million. Blanco not only took Cosby on as her protege, she trusted him to run much of her multi-billion-dollar business in the United States. Cosby became the largest supplier of cocaine to black neighborhoods, where it was turned into crack. However, the godmother's lengthy imprisonment gave courage to her enemies. In 1992, Chiqui was killed in a shooting at a Medellin nightclub. Blanco vowed revenge, and Osvaldo's killers were captured, tortured, and murdered. Blanco's legal troubles did not end there, however. In 1994, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office began investigating her organization, and worst of all, prosecutors managed to get the cooperation of Rivi Ayala. Ayala was accidentally caught robbing a bank for loose change, but didn't take into account that it had a video surveillance system. When Rivi was indicted on charges including the murder of 2-year-old Johnny Castro, he quickly spoke up. When Blanco heard that her most trusted enforcer had betrayed her, she had a nervous breakdown. During a prison visit in the spring of 1995, Cosby vowed to Blanco, "We will fight these bastards in court." But Blanco only replied, "Rivi has enough dirt on me to bury me 10 times. Blanco then slipped her hand into her bra, pulled out a tiny piece of paper from a notepad labeled JFK 5MNY, and held it out to Cosby. "What does this mean?" asked Cosby, puzzled by the cryptic message. "Dixon will understand," Blanco replied. But Cosby explained that he didn't want to get involved in any venture and pressed the distraught woman. That's when Griselda told him they were going to take a stand against President Kennedy, kidnap his son, and then trade him for Griselda. Blanco had already paid the would-be kidnappers $5 million, and the plan was detailed. "Hell will rain down on us," was all Cosby could say. Discouraged by the godmother's plan, but she accused Cosby of disloyalty and even compared him to Rivi, which meant if Cosby couldn't hand over the note, he could be killed. For example, when he would be leaving the store with his daughter and motorcyclists would pass by. Frightened, Cosby did pass the note to Dixon, who, by the way, really disliked him because he didn't want to deal with black people. Shortly thereafter, 4 Colombian kidnappers hired by Blanco landed in New York and met Cosby at a safe house in upstate New York. Cosby handed the kidnappers several small-caliber handguns, after which the kidnappers traveled to the Tribeca neighborhood where Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy lived in a spacious loft. While the kidnappers watched Kennedy's residence, Cosby flew back to California to keep some distance from the insane plot. Meanwhile, the kidnappers had no luck tracking down one of Manhattan's most famous residents. They couldn't even spot Kennedy Jr. outside his home. A few days later, they finally spotted him walking his dog and quietly surrounded him. One of the kidnappers got close enough to pet the dog on the head. But before they could do anything, an NYPD patrol car drove by. The kidnapping failed, and John Jr. himself learned of the attempt much later. Shocked, Cosby began to pull away from Blanco. Without the knowledge of the godmother, prosecutors from the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office subpoenaed him. Tortured by the situation with Blanco, he flew to Florida to testify in the case. Cosby insists that he provided information that deliberately understated the reach and profits of Blanco's organization. I said it was making $2 million, when in fact it was 50 times that much. But because Rivi was in their pocket, prosecutors nailed Blanco. In July 1995, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office charged her with 3 murders, even though Rivi had leaked information about at least 200 episodes somehow connected to Griselda. But then something completely unbelievable happened. After testifying, Cosby suddenly said that he had sex with one of the secretaries of the state prosecutor's office, which was involved in the case of Blanco. Worse, that same horny secretary had a lengthy phone sex session with Rivi Ayala, and everyone in line behind him had already heard it. It was essentially a technicality, but by 1998, when the prosecution's 2 main witnesses were completely discredited, the case against Blanco fell apart. Rivi Ayala received a life sentence and is still alive, while Griselda was given a final sentence of 20 years in 1998, of which she has already served 12 after her confession of complicity in 3 murders. By June 2004, the godmother was released from prison for health reasons. In 2002, she suffered a heart attack after learning that her second son had been murdered in Medellin. Blanco was deported back to Colombia, though the prospects of freedom in her homeland were not rosy. If I was deported to the country where my sons were killed, I wouldn't feel too comfortable either, Agent Palumbo said at the time. Only Michael Corleone, who grew up in foster care and hadn't seen his mother since he was 7 years old, was still alive. In fact, almost everyone assumed that on Colombian soil, Blanco's days were numbered. But no. In late spring 2007, a year after the premiere of the documentary Cocaine Cowboys, its creator, Alfred Spellman, received an email from a friend with a cell phone photo of Blanco taken at the Bogota airport in May 2007. To everyone's surprise, Blanco was unharmed. She has tons of money hidden in different bank accounts that have never been seized, and no one is doing anything to look for her because it's been 20 years since she last had real enemies, said Agent Palumbo. And she never had a case filed against her in Colombia, so this droopy old woman was of absolutely no interest to the authorities. The woman in that photo was nothing like the Black Widow of urban legend. Blanco had been cocaine-free for over a decade and led a quiet life in Medellin. Without makeup, hair dye, and designer clothes, in her 65 years, the godmother looked more like a regular grandmother. She did not socialize with men and lived in a modest house with a friend. Griselda became devout and attended church every week. She also quietly went to the same butcher shop every week, and no one recognized this fat old woman as the former La Madrina until one autumn Monday morning in 2012. After purchasing $150 worth of beef, she was shot by a passing killer on a motorcycle. A middle-aged man slowly rode up to Blanco, fired 2 shots to the head, and also drove away slowly. Her pregnant sister-in-law ran up to Griselda's fallen body, but the godmother was already dead. None of the witnesses until the last moment knew who the woman was, and later one of them said that the killer did not hide. Before the shots, he looked stunned Griselda in the eyes and did not hurry anywhere. He was a true professional. Of course, it is still unknown who this man was. After all, in her long life, Griselda Blanco had made so many enemies and did so many terrible deeds without statute of limitations that it could be anyone. But the method chosen is not accidental. It was the method once invented by the godmother Griselda Blanco de Trujillo. In January 2024, Griselda, a series about Blanco's life in Miami, was released on Netflix. The series turned out to be dynamic, dramatic, and very beautiful. But, as Michael Corleone said, it is not a biography, but a fanfic about narcos. One cannot disagree with him. Almost all the facts about the life of the real godmother are randomly arranged or combined for the sake of spectacle or timing. But the only thing we can say with certainty is that the real-life story of Griselda Blanco is not comparable to any fiction of the most skillful Hollywood screenwriter. And most likely, if they decided to screen it from start to finish, no one would believe it.